Okay, before we get started, I want to clarify something. Yes, I am aware this game is officially titled Castlevania. However, that is also the official title of the 1986 NES game. I like clarity, so I have opted to refer to this game as Castlevania 64, a common moniker used to refer to this game due to the fact that so many games on the N64 were titled like that. Not exactly sure why they didn't just call it that in the first place, because we have to make that clarification every time someone brings up this piece of shit in conversation. Yeah, I just said that. Anyway, Castlevania was one of the iconic trilogies of the NES. Though they never posted the same sales as Mario or Zelda, they garnered a dedicated fan base thanks to their combination of action and platforming, state-of-the-art graphics, memorable subject matter, and exceptional music. However, the series sort of stumbled when it got to the 16-bit era. Now, it's not to say that the games that came out during this time period were bad. As a matter of fact, Super Castlevania IV, Rondo of Blood, and Bloodlines are some of the best games in the whole series. But with them being spread out across 3 consoles at the time, it was difficult for fans to keep up with them all. Konami must have realized this, so when it came time to start planning for the first game of the 32-bit era, which they also knew was going to be the series' jump to 3D, they set their sights on the N64. That probably made sense at the time. After all, the most successful Castlevania game of the 16-bit era was Super Castlevania IV, and that was because the series had built its fanbase on the NES. So when the SNES rolled out, most of them migrated over to the new console. However, Konami realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the same story on the N64. A lot of the SNES's installed base had jumped ship to the PlayStation, and considering the cheap production cost of the console, Konami couldn't ignore the money they were leaving on the table. So they decided to pull some staff off the N64 project and put them to work on a smaller title for the PlayStation. One Koji Igarashi was among them, and he would push forward many ideas he had for the game, such as incorporating a non-linear map to explore and RPG elements. The result was Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which would end up being a surprise hit for Konami. The success of Symphony of the Night would also get the hype train rolling for the N64 game, which was now in full production. After all, Symphony of the Night was made on the cheap by a bunch of rookies. Surely Konami's A game with a sizable budget could produce something even better, right? Sadly, that couldn't be any further from the truth. Behind the scenes, the project was floundering. The team was inexperienced with 3D game design, and they struggled to picture what a Castlevania game would look like in 3D. It also didn't help that there was a lot of corporate interference, as you had guys in suits constantly making suggestions as to what would make the game more appealing to a wider audience. The whole thing just became a complete and utter mess, and it's incredible that the team got the game over the finish line in the first place. At the time though, the Hell's development cycle was not reflected in the game's reception. The game did get good marks from critics, and it was a decent seller. It actually outsold Symphony of the Night initially, but those numbers dropped off pretty quickly while Symphony of the Night continued to chug along. Couple this with the failure of its sequel and a less than stellar track record in retrospective, and you have a picture that is far from pretty. Though Castlevania 64 might not be the worst game you are likely to play, there is no denying that it's pretty damn bad.
Courage. Don't leave me.
Castlevania 64 takes place in 1852 and sees players take the role of either Reinhard Schneider, the current holder of the Vampire Killer, or Carrie Fernandez, an orphan girl with magic powers. The two find themselves drawn to a castle in Transylvania, and given the location, I'm sure you guys can guess who owns the castle. So now the two must fight their way through the hordes of monsters that call the castle home so that they can banish Dracula back to the grave. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, folks, the story here is garbage. Now, it's not to say that there aren't any interesting ideas present here. Some of them would actually be revisited in later Castlevania games, but as they are presented, they are ultimately wasted. The characters are bland and forgettable, the pacing is slow, the dialogue is poorly written, and the overall narrative leaves something to be desired. A big part of why the story is so uninteresting is due in large part to the graphics. The character models and animations just aren't expressive enough to get the necessary emotion across to make these scenes land. And though there is some voice acting in the game, it's so sparse and rarely around when it's needed. Now, it's not to say that the voice acting is necessary to tell a good story. Ocarina of Time pulled it off, but the character models were expressive enough to leave an impact. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have something like Metal Gear Solid, which also has unexpressive graphics similar to Castlevania 64, but the cutscenes still landed thanks to Kojima's understanding of cinematography and the stellar voice acting. Because Castlevania 64 has neither, the story doesn't land at all. Take this scene for instance. This should be a heavy-duty moment, but it's not. Add some voice acting, some choice music, some better dialogue, and I'm sure it could work, but as it is here, it just doesn't. The rest of the presentation isn't up to snuff either. I already commented on how unexpressive and stiffly animated the characters are, but the levels don't look much better. Now that's not to say that there aren't any instances where they look good. There are times when the game does nail the look and vibe you'd expect from a Castlevania game, but when I think of the level design in Castlevania 64, this is typically what comes to mind. Big, open, and empty. I think the biggest injustice of the game is the soundtrack. Castlevania is a series that is famous for its outstanding musical acumen, so imagine how disappointed it is to find that Castlevania 64 barely has any music, and when it does, it's bland and uninspired. Some might say that the game is going for a more atmospheric soundtrack, but there's a difference between the sound design being atmospheric and being left in silence. You need more than the sound of your own footsteps to achieve a thick atmosphere. For a series that has always been top of the class in regards to presentation, it begs the question as to how this could happen. Well, this is just speculation, but if I had to wager a guess, I would say the subpar presentation was a result of corporate meddling. Looking at the presentation, it reminds me a lot of the graphics in Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil. I wouldn't be surprised if Konami insisted that the team design the graphics in this manner so that a PS1 port would be easier later on. A terrible idea if you ask me, because you're supposed to do it the other way around. As a result, the presentation suffers big time. So the story and presentation sucks. How's the gameplay? Well, first impressions honestly weren't that bad. Movement feels okay, jumping is fluid enough, and it's fun to slay enemies. Reinhardt makes use of the Vampire Killer, which has a limited range but is pretty powerful, while Carrie uses projectile magic, which has a charge period but has a longer range. By the by, I hate playing as Carrie. It just doesn't feel like Castlevania if you're playing as a schoolgirl. And before anyone brings up Maria Bernard from Rondo of Blood, I feel the same way about her, but at least the game acknowledged how silly it was. Would have killed the developers to make Carrie more like Sifa or Maria as an adult. So I mostly stuck to Reinhardt, and as I kept playing, some problems made themselves abundantly clear very quickly. For starters, the combat blows. The game uses an automatic targeting system. When enemies are within range, a cursor will appear on them, and when it turns red, it means they're within attack range. I'm sure that made sense on paper, but in practice, it's faulty. It's really hard to see the cursor, so you often find yourself attacking enemies you didn't want to. For example, you go after this giant skeleton, and you'll find yourself attacking the smaller skeletons instead. It's really aggravating, and is a constant problem throughout the game. Really makes me appreciate the manual targeting and Ocarina of Time more now that I think about it. Speaking of Zelda, one component of its lock-on system is crucially missing from Castlevania 64, and that's that when you are locked on, Link shifts into a fighting stance and stays facing towards the enemies. In Castlevania 64, you have to physically point yourself towards the enemy. It makes the whole system feel clunky and janky. It's also interesting to note that you have some extra attack options such as a close quarters attack and sub-weapons, but they do bugger all damage or are unwieldy. In regards to the sub-weapons, it doesn't even feel like they thought about how they would work in 3D. The camera is a constant problem too. Like Zelda, you can recenter the camera behind your character with the push of a button, but here it's far less reliable. The camera often gets hung up on walls, and at times it's fixed. And more often than not, these camera issues rear their ugly head during platforming sections. You know, when you really need to see what you're doing. Now, being the platforming vet I am, I can for the most part cope with these shitty camera angles, but I was definitely holding my breath every time I went to make a jump. You know, thinking about all the design here, I'm sort of getting the sense the team didn't think too hard about how Castlevania would function in 3D. Like, the only thing they did was make the game 3D without changing anything else. How about instead of only being able to attack what's right in front of you, why not have attacks that cover a wide field of effect? Why not have the sub-weapons serve as ranged weapons? Why not directly copy the manual lock-on system from Ocarina of Time, or build every aspect of the game around Fit's cameras? Kinda like Devil May Cry. Yeah, that worked, didn't it? You see what I'm talking about? As if that wasn't bad enough, the game's structure is just horrendous too. Castlevania 64 should have been a straight action platformer with a point A to point B setup. I know some people might say that would have been a step backwards from Symphony of the Night, but given that this was the first game in the series to be in 3D, keeping things simple would have been smart. So, is that what they did? What do you think? The game actually puts a lot of focus on exploration, which would be fine if the levels were actually fun to explore. Again, most of the levels are like this with very little in the way of points of interest. They do try to mix things up with maze-like level design, having to avoid enemies that can't be killed, or trying to get through sections without taking a hit or jumping. And it's not very good. I've heard some people describe these sections as survival horror, and I think that's ridiculous. Also, that section where you can't jump or take a hit, yeah. That's where I tapped out, guys. I didn't finish this one, and I had no desire to. Some people might say I can't give a full opinion on the game if I didn't take the time to finish it, but that point in the game comes 3/4 of the way through. I don't care if the last quarter of the game is the most amazing piece of game design ever. I'd still say the game as a whole sucks. It's short too, it only lasts 3 or 4 hours. Twice if you want to go back and replay the game as the other character. But who the hell would want to play this twice? Castlevania 64 was supposed to be a bigger game than it actually was, and with its strong sales initially, Konami allowed the team to continue working on the stuff that needed to be cut and release it as a sort of enhanced edition of the game. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness primarily featured a new campaign starring Cornell, the beastman who sets out to rescue his sister from Dracula. The game also includes Reinhardt and Carrie's campaign from 64, as well as another new character named Henry Orderly. That's a lot of content, and that's in addition to the enhanced graphics and sound courtesy of the N64's expansion pack. All this makes Legacy of Darkness a superior game, but like I said, this game bombed hard at retail, so it's one of the more rare and expensive N64 games. With the failure of the N64 games, the future of the series was left in question. Failing to make the jump was typically the death sentence for franchises at the time, as was the case with Contra and Earthworm Jim. Thankfully, the next big game in the series, Circle of the Moon, would become the first game in the series to sell over 1 million copies. Its success, along with that of Symphony of the Night, showed that there was still a demand for 2D games in the series, and that the GBA was the perfect place to release them. So they handed the reins of the series off to Igarashi, who would spend the next couple of years making Metroidvania-style games. This kept the series alive, so Castlevania would get a few more shots at making the 3D transition. Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness would be more successful in bringing the series into 3D, but critics agreed that they didn't match up to other action games that were coming out at the time like Devil May Cry or God of War. It wouldn't be until 2010's Lord of the Shadows that people agreed Konami finally got it right. Even then though, the success was short-lived as they never properly followed it up. It's been a while since we've had another Castlevania game, but that dry period seems to be coming to an end. Castlevania Belmont's Curse is due out sometime this year, with it again adopting a Metroidvania style as opposed to a 3D action game. I swear, the series' track record with 3D is almost as bad as Sonic's, and it started with Castlevania 64. It's a curse that the series hasn't been able to break yet, but it's nice to know that the initial failure to make the jump to 3D wasn't enough to kill the franchise. Much like Dracula himself, it's a franchise that will come back again and again and again.